Hi, everyone. Welcome to the San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books. I am Jeanelle Horcasitas, and I am delighted to introduce our two featured authors today for this panel, Tracy Deonn and her book Legendborn, and Kiersten White and her book Camelot Betrayal. And so we're going to get straight to it, start out the questions, and open up with a fun little icebreaker. I know this is going to be a tough question because I know it is for me, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Who is your favorite author? We'll start with Tracy.
Oh, this is such a hard question. What do I usually say? I mean, I can say that the author that most influenced my writing in terms of Legendborn in particular, but just the sense that there was something out there that I could write, was definitely Susan Cooper, who wrote the Darkest Rising sequence. And I give a shout out to Susan Cooper in the back of my book. That was the first time I ever interacted with contemporary fantasy. At the level at which she was working is really inspirational and wonderful. And then I'll also cite Paul Beatty, who wrote The White Boy Shuffle, which is like a satirical novel of fiction, because that was the first time I ever realized that I could write using my own voice. So it's a cheat. These are not my favorites, but I can talk about them and think about them pretty quickly.
Great. This sounds like it's inspiration. So if you can't name a favorite, maybe the inspiration. Kiersten, what about you?
Yeah, it's such a tricky question because there are definitely authors where I will read anything they ever write, like Laini Taylor. Doesn't matter what the book is. I want it shoved in my brain. I really, really love this debut author. Her name is Tracy Deonn. She wrote one of my favorite books of the last couple of years called Legendborn. You might have heard of it. But I love books where I read them and I feel like only this person could have written them, right? Like they feel so specific and so... as a writer, you tend to pick things apart, right? Like when you read books, you're constantly like, how did they do this? How did they do this? And so when I come across a writer where I'm like, I don't know how they did that, and I could not personally have done that, those are always my favorites. So I'd say consistently one of my favorite authors along those lines is Shirley Jackson. She's one of those authors where I tend to take photos of passages or sentences that I like so that I can pull them apart and study them later. And whenever I'm reading The Haunting of Hill House, I'm taking a photo of like every single page because she has this way of like starting a sentence and you think you know where it's going. And by the end of the sentence, she's completely inverted it and turned it on its head in the most surprising way that also somehow feels inevitable. And I don't know how she does it. I've never been able to figure it out. So yeah, her work always just feels like this constant revelation and I love it.
Awesome. Well, I had a lot of fun reading both of your books, and I noticed, they're both unique, so unique in their own way, but they are also drawing from this medieval time and King Arthur. And I was just curious, what, you both are speaking to and rewriting this kind of history and this kind of mythology in your own ways and modernizing it or bringing in some modern topics. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about why that was an aspect of the book that you wanted to bring in, and other important components that you wanted to make connections with in regard to the Round Table, King Arthur, and the different society and the setup for all of that, and how it's working in your two books. So we'll start with Kiersten this time.
Yeah. So my series of the Camelot Rising trilogy has started with the Gwynevere Deception. The Camelot Betrayal came out in November, and then book 3, The Excalibur Curse, comes out in December. So if you read these two, you'll be able to get your conclusion very soon. And these books started the way all of my retellings start, in that it's something that I love. It's a storytelling tradition that I love and that lights my brain on fire and that's always captured my imagination, but also that I find lacking, that frustrates me or makes me angry. And in the case of Camelot, it's the treatment of women, Guinevere in particular. And there are a lot of modern retellings that do right by her, that do right by the women. But going back to the traditional Arthurian cycles, like the oldest versions of the stories, like they just treat their women so terribly. And it's like Arthur went into a forest and he ran into a knight, and the knight was like, "You can't go past here." And Arthur's like, "I gotta go past there." So then they're like, "Guess we gotta fight." So they fight for 5 hours, and at the end of 5 hours, they're like, "You know what, dude? You are such a good fighter. Let's be BFFs now." And the other knight's like, "Dude, you are such a good fighter. Let's be BFFs now. I'm gonna stop being king and start following you." And like, there's so much bromance that happens, and there's so much like, it just all focuses on all these like random fights that are always happening. And then there's like this aside, and oh, by the way, during that time period, he married this chick from Camilliard, and then he fought this guy. And like, that's not the part that's interesting to me, right? I'm interested in the relationships. I'm interested in how the kingdom functions. I'm interested in how you shift a country from whatever came before, which in the case of Uther Pendragon was violence and conquest, to like order and rules and chivalry and all of these things. And where do the women fit in that? And one of the things that I really looked at when I was exploring a lot of the old Camelot tales was whose story is being told, and in telling that story, whose stories aren't we telling? And so I decided to write from the point of view of Gwynevere, and I wanted to be a very traditional Camelot tale. It's set in sort of a magical fantasy type Camelot, in a very anachronistic pre-medieval England, which I can get away with because Arthurian tales have always been wildly anachronistic. So I'm just participating in a long literary tradition, and I focus on the women, and that for me was why I wanted to tell this story. I wanted to reclaim Guinevere as a person with agency, as a person who has a story worthy of telling, other than just falling in love with the wrong person and destroying everything, right? So yeah, that, and also I just wanted to write something magical and swoony and romantic. I had written a few very like heavy, dark books in a row, and so I was like, this is the one. This is the one that's just going to be fun and easy and swoony. And then, it turns out, no, I'm just grappling with the same things that I always do, but there's slightly more kissing. So, and I'm really excited to hear Tracy. I talk about Tracy's book all the time because I love what she does and how she engages with Arthurian myth. And this is the thing that I think is so exciting, both about retellings, but about Arthurian myth specifically, is that Arthurian legends have always been community storytelling. From day one, somebody saw a name, they wrote a poem, somebody else saw that poem, they wrote a poem, somebody saw that poem, they wrote an epic, on and on, everybody adding, everybody bringing new characters, everybody shifting the tale to try and explore something else. And this is why I love Arthurian retellings. I loved writing mine, and I also love reading them because everybody brings something new to it, and it's just so cool to be part of such a long, long storytelling tradition. And I love Tracy's contribution to it.
You're so kind. Kiersten was probably the first author to read Legendborn and get back to me and just like have gleeful shouting. Like one of the very first ones as we were looking at blurbs and things. So I will always remember your enthusiasm being so affirming right before the book came out. So whenever someone asks about sort of my engagement with Arthurian retelling or reimagining, I can cite, like I said, Susan Cooper, who did something similar, but even she sort of did it in a way where it was supporting a different story, right? Like Arthur and that sort of the legends were more embedded in the setting even than necessarily the storytelling in Wales and in her sequence. So for me, I was actually thinking from a personal space always at the beginning of this process. I imagined Bree. I imagined a girl who had lost her mother and who wanted answers and was grieving and angry and frustrated. And she came to mind really years before I ever started writing this story. I had this image of a young Black girl who could go on a quest to find out an impossible answer to an everyday question, which is why has someone in my life died? And so I thought of that because of my own personal experience with grief and loss of my mother. But where it became an epic tale is that I found out not long after my own mother passed away that her mother had died when she was about my age. And then that went back yet another generation. And I remember thinking, this is such a mystery. Why would this happen? as a science fiction fantasy writer and fangirl, I'm like, there's a story here. But also thinking about my, sort of positionality as an African-American woman who can't really trace back more than probably about 4-ish generations, because you come up against the wall of enslavement in American history. And so I just started thinking about like, well, what if I'm imagining a girl, Bree, my character, who's in a modern day situation, and she's looking for her legacy and she's looking for her lineage and her power, and she comes up against this wall. And I was just thinking, where are the places where that just doesn't happen? And as Kiersten was talking about, like Arthurian tales just live on forever, have been around for 1,500 years. And this is a dude who historians are like, he never existed. And yet there's a gazillion stories about him, a gazillion origin stories, a gazillion versions of how he became, king, and his journey and the people around him. And so I just sort of thinking, from a community perspective, what are the stories that we tell over and over and over again about that are completely fictional and that stand the test of time and might even get like a statue somewhere? And then what are the stories that get lost because no one was there to tell that story? No one was able to write it down, encouraged to write it down or remember it. So I think I think Kiersten and I are actually wrestling with something really similar, right? Of just like what stories are not getting told. And so once I started thinking about Arthur, I just said, well, what if we put those two things in conversation? Well, what would the story be if we had a modern day Black girl who doesn't have that ability? And where would she find her power, and how would that show up? And so Arthur came up really as sort of, at first, I think just a symbol, the Arthurian canon of the sort of weight of that much story about someone who wasn't real. um, and then thinking about, what are the stories that get lost, right? I grew up in the South, so there's a lot of storytelling and mythologizing about things that didn't happen, and people that, won wars that didn't win, and things like that. And so there's a lot of sort of in the air, this constant conversation about who's telling the story of history, and what triumphs are we celebrating. So that's kind of where Arthur showed up. But then once I got into it, it just became fun. And I really enjoyed the tradition, which is just mushing stuff together and then calling it lore. It's terrific. That's what Tennyson did. That's, people sort of cite certain stories, but really they're fan fiction of previous fan fictions of the story. I love talking about how Lancelot showed up like 600 years into what we think of as the beginning of Arthurian storytelling, but everyone thinks he's like the OG knight, like he was always there, and he wasn't. So I just had a lot of fun sort of reworking the story in order to tell the story I wanted to tell, right? And using Arthur in sort of support of the story, which is sort of, I think, some people are surprised that Legendborn even has Arthurian things in it, because it's not on the back of the book. Simon & Schuster did a really clever thing where they focused on the main character and her journey, and then Legendborn being an Arthurian reimagining is like, ta-da, it's like a surprise.
Oh, I love that. Thank you both for those great answers. You brought up a lot of really great themes and ideas about this idea of community and bringing in these historically underrepresented stories, grappling with things like power, and especially with women, and always being on the margins, not having that representative voice. And so I was curious just about, the characters themselves, and the intention that you had with creating, for example, Gwynevere. She's grappling a lot of times with this immense power, and there's this idea, I have to control it, I have to be tame, and everyone around her has the support of her, and she never, she's always able to kind of advocate for herself in that way and have that agency. But when it's her internal self, she's grappling with that issue of power. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about power when it comes to magic, and some of those struggles that Guinevere is dealing with in your book, Kiersten.
Yeah, absolutely. The magic system was something that I put a lot of thought into, right? Because I think magic tends to be sorted into two things, either like the big elemental magic or like the smaller, more complex magic systems. And in the Camelot Rising trilogy, I did both. So you have sort of the elemental magic that shaped Camelot, that shaped the area with the Lady of the Lake and with Merlin and with the Dark Fairy Queen. And then you have the magic that humans have access to. And so for that magic system, I took things from a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, which was basically the witch hunter's Bible during the medieval period, and it's an evil book. Like, it's straight up evil. It was written by a small, violent man and used to persecute women. Right, so they used it as an excuse and a way to control women, to hurt women who had autonomy, and to kill women. And that pisses me off because it's also a really stupid book, right? Like, you read it and it's like, oh, well, if your horse seems sick and you have a neighbor who doesn't like you, go up into your attic. And if there's any rope in your attic and if there's any knots in that rope in your attic, neighbor's a witch. She's been cursing you. And like, what? But people use that and people believe that. And they used it as justification for harming women. And so I thought, well, you know what? I'm taking that. You can't have that anymore. And I used what I called knotting as my magic system in the book, where you can knot small pieces of finite contained magic into whatever you're doing, because it felt very sort of traditionally feminine to me, right? Like, you're creating things, you're doing clothing, you're doing embroidery, you're doing it in hair, in these little detail ways that somebody who doesn't know the work that goes into it is never going to notice. You're only going to know what you're seeing if you're somebody who knows how to do it, right? And it's just this finite magic, this way of carving out protection and power for yourself and for the people that you love. And so that's the very human magic system. And then, in competition with this big, hard to control, oftentimes violent, just because it's not mortal magic, it's not human magic. So it doesn't care about, the very breakable human bodies that it's engaging with. And it was important to me to grapple with that, because when you read a lot of the Arthurian cycles, Merlin is, he's evil. He's violent. He has his like good things that he's doing, but in order to do those things, he's constantly leaving a trail of women's bodies in his wake. Like, he's constantly using and discarding women in incredibly violent and traumatic ways in order to create the king who's going to save everyone, right? And so I wanted to explore that. I wanted to explore the nature of power. Like, what does it mean to be queen when you're married to a king who's there by, divine and magical right? And so everything he chooses has to be the right thing, right? How do you find your voice there? How do you lead alongside him? Or do you just sort of get subsumed in his wake? And those are the big questions that I was asking with Gwynevere. And it's what makes it, I think, a YA series, because so much of Guinevere is, she knows who she wants to be, she knows what she wants to do, but at the same time, she's not sure who she is or how she fits into it. So she's constantly trying on these new identities, trying to figure out how to make the impact that she wants to in the world while still being true to herself, even though she's not quite sure who she is. And for me, that was a very, very relatable thing as a teen. Like, I wanted to do big things, I wanted to make a difference, but I still wanted to fit into my community in the specific ways that they said I had to, and all of these things. So for me, Gwynevere, I wanted her greatest power to be compassion, because I think that's what's missing in a lot of the Arthurian legends, right? Is this sense of compassion, because they go for nobility and they go for justice and they go for chivalry, but there's very little compassion. And so I wanted a queen who led first, who looked at people who maybe presented as prickly. My favorite relationship she has is with a woman named Dindrain, who is nobility, but she's like shuffled to the side nobility. So she's nobility without power. And because of that, she's turned very mean and bitter, and she's going to attack you before you attack her. And Gwynevere immediately sees past this and is like, oh, I want to get to know you. Like, I want to be your friend. And she has this way of engaging heart first with the world that allows the people around her to become the best versions of themselves, because she is the person in Camelot who's leading with compassion. And I loved writing that. I really, really like exploring the different ways that, particularly as women, we can be powerful and we can be strong. And I've explored that, through violence. I've explored that through manipulation. And with Guinevere, I very much wanted to do, so much of her power comes from her very big heart and her tremendous compassion for other people. So it meant a lot to me to write her. And it was a very a very thoughtful process of putting together who my Guinevere was and who Camelot was around her and because of her.
Oh, thank you, Kiersten. I definitely felt the compassion and the strong connections, to Ronjon and Lancelot and Arthur, like everyone in her circle. She was just very loving and a lot of times just put them before herself. Mm-hmm. So very selfless. Mm-hmm. And so, Tracy, I had a similar question. So you did mention a little bit of power and legacy in your previous response, but I just wanted you to expand a little bit more about Bree's own, how she's navigating this own exploration of magic and gaining this generational knowledge that, was untapped, and how it just connects with all of these different histories. You mentioned, it's hard to connect to these, a lot of times, histories that have been erased, especially with enslavement, and adding and rewriting with these new ideas in mind and building a new community around it, so that, folks feel represented, included in those spaces. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about Bree, if you can, and her engagement with magic and power and the generational knowledge that she's getting.
Yeah, with Bree, she starts out really just asking one core question, which is what happened to my mother, and that's her mission pretty early on in the book, and she's pretty much willing to do whatever it takes to get the answer, because to not have that answer is to wonder if she missed something, if she contributed to the circumstances of her mother's death, if she could have stopped it, there's all these questions, and she doesn't want that. She wants the answer. And what I found with that search, because, for me and for really, I assume everyone who's ever lost someone they love, you could search for that answer your whole life and really not come back with a definitive one. And so that question is going to lead you to different possible avenues. And so you might look to people you're related to, or you might look to people in your community. And I've found that particularly in the Black American community, looking to elders who may or may not be related to you, is how you sort of get answers about your past, or how you get answers about your community. And relying on oral traditions is something that is very sort of common and sort of built into a lot of Black American communities. And then also sort of understanding that people who, particularly women who have been in community with other women, have a sort of collective knowledge that isn't even necessarily specific to your situation, but is worth drawing on. So Bree has a mentor in the book who's an older Black woman, based on an amalgamation of people, but also my experience of going to school and finding someone who became a sort of maternal figure, because of the information she had about where our community had come from and what they'd been able to survive, right? And that was a different type of teaching. And then Bree expands it and is able to interact with other Black women in other ways, in magical ways. And what I found was really powerful about that is how, well, actually, I can say what's interesting about that, as someone who's listening to other people analyze it, is that often people feel as though Bree's talking to her family throughout this entire sort of arc in the book. And she's really not. But that sense of like familial sisterhood, motherhood, auntie, like that, I think that just sort of pervades the book. But it's really interesting how they're like, oh yes, and then she interacts with this family member and this one, and I'm like, these people are not related to her, but there's a community that's bound together through common experience and common struggle and common oppression. And so growing from that place, and sort of understanding that there's things you can learn from other people who are not blood related to you about your own family. I just thought it was really interesting and really familiar. There's also a sense of sort of intuitive magic and intuitive, feminine magic and ability that I think floats through a lot of Black American women communities, whether or not you're actually practicing folk magic like root work in the book that I call rootcraft, or it's just sort of a sense of like, oh, I had a bad feeling about this. You go to maybe a hair salon and there's someone in the back who's like, I always knew that this was going to happen because when he came in, he did this, and then I felt that. And then I went to bed that night and this happened. And there's just sort of like this sense that there's an extra sense, sort of a paranormal sense of what's happening in the world that's threaded through Black women's communities that I really wanted to sort of tap into, because Bree's not going to be able to look back at her situation with her mother and be able to say 100%, this is why and how. Like, that's just not, even if she gets the answer, halfway through the book, she starts to question whether or not it's going to be enough, right? And so then where do you fill in the gaps of that? Even if you do get the answer, where do you fill in the gaps of what you're really looking for, which is missing the guidance of your mom and missing that sort of like feminine sort of guidance and power. So for me, the legacy almost went like lateral. I think I was trying to sort of show that sometimes that connection can move across communities who are, present and not just looking back.
Great. Thank you both so much. So we are almost to the end of our time. We're wrapping up. So, I just had one question that we could just answer very briefly is what are you hoping that readers will connect with most or will resonate with in your books? What is it? What are you hoping their aha moment will be, or what they feel most connected to?
I can start.
We'll start with you, Tracy.
Yeah. What I want, and I feel like Kiersten's going to be nodding along with this, is particularly I want young women, young girls, and definitely young Black girls for lots of reasons to feel when they read my books and my work that their emotions are valid, and that their emotions and feelings about things that they're experiencing are not only valid, but they're powerful and they're worth spending time with. They're worth pursuing. They're worth sort of like, not dismissing or shutting down, and that expressing emotion is also really, really valid. I think that we see a lot in Black girls growing up that they're sort of asked to be adults in ways that their peers are not. And I really want girls to feel as though they can sit in a space of being true to themselves and not have to grow up and be an adult before they need to, but also only do so if you want to, right? Like there's this external pressure to suppress your emotions and not count them as important, because that's the way to adulthood. And I think that gets turned into a weird depression thing. So yeah, that's kind of what I want. And I also think that it shows in the book, because Bree's drive, the whole engine behind the book is Bree's emotional state. And she's 16, so it's a lot. But that is the whole momentum behind the story. The book wouldn't happen if she hadn't valued her own emotional state above everything else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very similar, unsurprisingly. The very first thing that I wrote for this book was the first line, which isn't always how books happen. And this line stayed the same through every single draft. It says, "There is nothing in the world as magical and terrifying as a girl on the cusp of womanhood." And that kind of became the thesis for the whole series. This idea that teenage girls have so much power and potential, and also people are legitimately terrified of them. And because of that, they try to hold them back. They try to hold them down. They try to tell them what they can and can't be, what they should and shouldn't be. They mock them. While still also trying to take advantage of the things that they love and the things that they do. And so, yeah, I very, very much wanted to write this book for the exact same reasons, to say, like, your feelings are valid. And not only that, your feelings are powerful. And you have so much more power than the world tells you that you do and that the world wants you to have. And it's up to you the ways that you use that. And that's a pretty constant theme throughout my books. Because, Tracy and I have both written like really fun, big, exciting, action-packed books that are going to appeal to like teenagers and to adults and to anyone, no matter how they identify as far as gender. But we are also specifically, first and foremost, writing for teenage girls. And that's a really special thing. And I think we both, take it very seriously, right? Like, I feel like it's a big responsibility. But it's also just like a joy to tell those stories. So yeah, I hope that people connect with that. I hope that people feel validated. And I hope they have fun. Like, you get to go to Camelot. What's not to like about that?
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you so
magic
much.
swords in mine. Like, who doesn't want multiple types of magic swords?
Right? Yeah, and like Tracy's supporting cast. They're I can see every time I think about Legendborn, I'm like, I need to read it now. It gets so much fun.
Well, I'm hopeful that readers will feel validated and empowered. And I wanted to thank you both again. Thank you, Kiersten. Thank you, Tracy, for spending time with us today and giving us a little bit more insight and sharing about your books. For those of you who are interested, you can check out the local book indie shops that the San Diego Festival of Books has partnered with. So some that come to mind are the Mysterious Galaxy, La Playa Books, Warwick's, and there's many more listed on the website. And I hope that you all will also please consider supporting the San Diego Council on Literacy and visiting their website as well. And you can continue to enjoy many other panels in this program by going to the San Diego Festival of Books website, sdfestivalofbooks.com. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you again, Kiersten and Tracy. It was really a pleasure to speak with you both. And again, I'm Jeanelle Horcasitas, and I hope you all have a great day. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you for having us.